Okay, so I guess we'll get started. Yeah, thank you everyone for registering for the Finding Autistic Wellbeing event. So first of all, just an introduction. Who am I? My name's Amy Adams. I'm a neurodivergent woman and the founder of Finding Autism. So at Finding Autism, I do counselling, therapy, consultancy, and creation of resources. And I offer this support to autistic individuals and their loved ones. So I'm obviously quite passionate about taking a neurodiversity affirming approach to support, and really passionate as well about centering those lived experiences of neurodivergence. A heads up as well, I am quite nervous. You can probably tell. I can tell already I'm a little bit breathy. So if I do sometimes pause, if I sound a bit shaky, that's to be expected. I'll probably just take it slow until the nerves settle a little bit. I can also feel my heart pounding out of my chest. Okay, so I'll just do a quick acknowledgement of country. So today I live and work on the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the lands and waters of Brisbane. I extend my deep gratitude and respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and to all elders past, present and emerging. So always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And just a quick disclaimer, I won't read through this whole slide, but just worth noting that this information is for educational purposes. It's not a substitute for mental health support. Some of the strategies that I go through might be helpful for some of you or some of your clients, but there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to autism. Each autistic person is different, so that's worth noting as well. And also some of the strategies that I speak about do encourage autistic authenticity and increasing emotional awareness. Sometimes these strategies can bring associated risks, particularly if you've got a trauma background, and there are risks associated with unmasking. So it is recommended, if you want to work through some of those strategies safely and effectively, that you do that with a mental health professional. Okay, so I've split the presentation component into two different sections. So in section 1, I'll be talking about some factors that negatively affect autistic wellbeing. So masking, lack of acceptance and belonging, alexithymia, or some people say alexithymia, I'm not quite sure which the right pronunciation is, and autistic burnout. And then section 2, we'll be talking about some strategies that help to foster autistic wellbeing. So these are evidence-based strategies to cope with some of the factors in section 1. Okay, so section 1, why do we sometimes as autistic individuals struggle with our well-being? The factors that I will speak about, it's not an exhaustive list of what impacts our well-being, but it's just some of the key ones that I've noticed in my work and also in the research as well. Okay, so the first topic I'll be talking about is camouflaging or masking. Some people use these terms interchangeably. Camouflaging is, I guess, broadly an umbrella term, which includes masking and other sort of strategies. And I'll sort of go in a little bit more into what that looks like in this next slide. So I did some research on this. I think it was last year. I created a survey and distributed it mostly across LinkedIn, but also Facebook groups where I've got a lot of autistic contacts. And I was looking exclusively at women and non-binary people and their experiences. So in the survey, there was 144 individuals who took part and provided some answers. Of those, 63% reported that they attempt to hide or minimize their traits to appear less autistic most of the time or always. So that's broadly what that camouflaging and masking is talking about. I also asked a short answer question, which was to do with what are some of the masking or camouflaging traits that you exhibit. I think it was worded a little bit more clearly than that, but it was really trying to get at what does masking or camouflaging look like for these autistic women. And some of the key themes that popped up, you can see this list of 8 different traits. They're in order of frequency. So the first one was suppressing soothing repetitive behaviors or fidgeting. You can't see because of how my camera is positioned, but as I talk, I fidget a lot with my hands. So if I was masking, I would be like trying to keep my hands still. That's just sort of one example of what that can look like. Number 2, adapting gestures or body movements. So actively adapting facial expressions, posture, and maybe nodding more frequently, or sort of forcing those sorts of body movements when they're not coming naturally. Number 3 is keeping quiet or suppressing urges to talk about one's own interests. 4 was studying and mimicking non-autistic behaviours that they observed, whatever those behaviours might have been in that context. Forcing eye contact was another one, engaging in small talk despite it feeling really forced or unnatural. Remaining in overwhelming situations and hiding emotions until alone or in a safe space, or actively adapting way of speaking, such as volume and tone, and sometimes pace, I think as well came up. Okay, so masking was quite prevalent in this sample, and that's been substantiated with other research. It is quite a common phenomenon amongst autistic individuals. So what are some of the impacts of masking? Is it adaptive? Is it not adaptive? Based off my research, but also lots, like there's tons of research in this space. Masking is, generally speaking, not adaptive for us. In my sample, 140 of the 144 autistic women mentioned exclusively negative impacts. So that means that only 4 of the respondents actually mentioned that it was adaptive for them. The rest were saying that they had all of these really negative effects from masking. So for example, feeling more anxious and overwhelmed was a key theme that came up. This deep sense of exhaustion, particularly as an after effect of masking. Afterwards, feeling quite depressed, empty, or this sort of numbness. Increased loneliness and disconnect from others. That's mostly during the masking process. Feeling lost within oneself. So there were lots of references to feeling like a fraud, feeling inauthentic, feeling this lack of a sense of self when masking. And also physical impacts typically occurring afterwards. So migraines, sickness, that kind of thing. And here are some quotes, in response to the question. So how does camouflaging or masking make you feel during and afterward? And so one of the autistic women said, I feel empty, dead inside, exhausted, not real, like I'm trying to communicate with others through foggy glass. Another said that during, it's akin to how most people, so like maybe people who aren't autistic, how they might feel during a really mentally strenuous task. And after, the exhaustion is so deep. And then another respondent said, it's exhausting during the performance because I need to keep track of so many layers of communication and information. And afterwards, it just makes me feel miserable. So I really liked that. I'm sorry, that's probably not the right way to say. I didn't really like that reference, but I find this reference here quite useful. That comparison to it being like a mentally strenuous task. I think that's quite a clear explanation for maybe people who aren't autistic. They're not really sure what we're talking about, and they're not really sure as to how masking or camouflaging might feel and how hard it is. It really is that it's very mentally strenuous, and that can partly explain why we feel this massive energy drain a lot of the time afterwards. So with all of these negative effects that do sometimes come from masking and camouflaging, why do we do it? Why is it something that's so prevalent? So in the same survey that I did, 40% of the respondents said that they regularly feel dismissed, judged, misunderstood, invalidated, disrespected, and discriminated against based on being different or mentioning to other people that they're autistic. And when asked, what is the hardest thing about being autistic for you? The top theme in this sample by far was this negative treatment from other people. So yeah, some strong data. Again, this is just one survey, but there are other research studies that do back these findings up as well. And you can see how this might lead into this motivation to hide or suppress autistic traits. So it is a little bit of a double bind. We're sort of damned if we do, we're damned if we don't, kind of thing. Which kind of feeds into this next factor that can negatively impact autistic well-being, and that's lacking acceptance and belonging. So again, still sort of the same survey that I did on 144 autistic individuals. I found that of that sample, around half of them said that they rarely or never felt a sense of belonging amongst other people in their lives. And this is despite 72% feeling that it's really important to feel heard, accepted, or that they belong. I think there is this sort of misconception that a lot of autistic people are happy to kind of be left to themselves, or they're happy just sort of being in their own little bubble, doing their own thing. That might be the case sometimes. Again, we can't make generalizations, but at least within the research that I did, within the sample of women that I got their experiences, a lot of them, yeah, they're craving that belonging. They can recognize that it's important for their well-being, but there's just that disconnect of not being able to really achieve that or find that easily in their lives. So this is research by Harmons et al., a recent 2022 study, and they looked into this sort of topic of acceptance as well. They read blog posts that reflected the views of 23 autistic women, and then used a thematic analysis to summarize what these women were saying about their well-being. And they found a big theme was this struggle for acceptance, both before but also after their autism diagnosis, and how that can be really exhausting trying to hide our difficulties or having to explain or justify autism to others. And I suspect that it's not just autistic women that experience this. I'm sure that other gender identities as well experience, yeah, similar things as well. And there's a few research studies by Headley et al., again, really looking into autistic well-being and how it relates to belonging. So they found that autistic people describe belonging to be a core aspect of their well-being. And in their studies, they found that those autistic individuals that reported indicators of thwarted belonging, so loneliness, lack of social support, a lack of acceptance, those were the individuals who are much more likely to experience depression and suicidal desire as compared to autistic individuals who don't have as much thwarted belonging. Okay, so the next topic that I'll go into is alexithymia. So alexithymia, broadly speaking, and I'll get a little bit more into what some of the core traits are in the next slide. It's broadly considered a personality construct, so it lists certain traits. It's not a mental health diagnosis, but it is something that is highly prevalent in autistic individuals. So approximately half of autistic people also have alexithymia, with statistics ranging from about 40 to 65%. So it's just something that I feel like because of that big overlap, it's worth touching on, and because of some of the implications for well-being as well. So what is alexithymia? Some of the core traits are difficulty perceiving and identifying emotions, struggling to distinguish between emotions and bodily sensations. So for example, maybe mixing up anxiety with hunger, or maybe feeling really just physically drained and misattributing that as feeling depressed or sad. So it's sort of like getting those muddled a little bit sometimes. A difficulty describing and articulating emotions to other people, particularly doing that verbally. So speaking about emotions can be really hard for someone with alexithymia. And some of the less common traits are, they might struggle to generate mental images or fantasies. There might be more attention paid to external things, so like facts, events, what's going on around you, rather than paying attention to internal experiences like emotions and those bodily sensations. And also vicarious interpretation of feelings. So an example of sort of what that means is, instead of intuitively interpreting what we feel by looking inward, we might ask someone else, if you were in my situation, how would you feel? What would you do? How would you react? And then interpreting our feelings based off the feedback that other people are giving to us. So it's worth just quickly touching on that alexithymia, similar to autism, does occur on a spectrum. So you can have low alexithymic traits, you can have high alexithymic traits, you can have some traits and not others. So it's not like a checklist where you have to have all of these to a strong degree. You can have, yeah, a mixture of different traits to different extents. So this is where alexithymia is quite relevant for the discussion around autistic well-being, is the link with emotion dysregulation. So alexithymia can provide a partial explanation as to why some autistic people, particularly those with high alexithymic traits, why they can experience challenges with managing emotions, because alexithymia does play a really important role in mood and anxiety difficulties. So like if we struggle to, for example, identify our emotions or to name what we're feeling, to describe it to other people, that kind of thing, it can be really hard to actually think about, it can be really hard to actually think about emotion regulation and matching the emotion to a very specific regulation strategy that fits. And it's also a big barrier when it comes to effective therapeutic support. So when we're talking about a clinician who's working with an autistic person, if they jump straight into emotion regulation strategies without considering alexithymia and the difficulties with even identifying or feeling emotions, it can be a really big barrier it can be a big barrier for that emotion regulation support to be effective. So it's important, I think, to sort of factor this in when we're talking about emotion dysregulation and also emotion regulation supports. Okay, so this is just a quote from an autistic adult, just to sort of provide an example of one person's experience with alexithymia. So on an intellectual level, I can understand how our thoughts, feelings, and behavior would be linked, but my reality is different. I mostly don't know what I'm feeling, and I tend to think possible feelings rather than genuinely feel them. I only really become aware of my feelings when they are very strong and out of control, and I'm entering meltdown. So I just thought that was a really clear example. My experience personally with alexithymia is very similar to this. As I said, it's on a spectrum, everyone will be different, but I personally related a lot to that quote. Okay, onto a really big topic. This was one that a lot of the people who registered, so you guys were sort of saying, yep, I want you to talk about autistic burnout. This is something that, yeah, is definitely important to touch on when we're thinking about autistic well-being. So what is autistic burnout? Broadly speaking, it occurs after an autistic person has been in a stressful environment or different stressful environments for prolonged periods of time without sufficient support. So some key triggers to burnout might be when external or internal demands are chronically outweighing ability to meet those demands, when we're engaging in camouflaging or masking in a way that's quite extreme or prolonged over time, when we are exposed to prolonged sensory overstimulation, prolonged stress, when there's lots of important life events or changes, particularly lots all at once, an inability to recover from meltdowns, shutdowns, or previous burnouts. So for example, not having a safe emotional space or physical space to actually recover from those, maybe having a meltdown and then the next day, you know, you have to go to work and you just can't, you don't have that time and space to actually rest and get that energy back. And you can see that I've underlined this last point because I feel like it's so important, this widespread lack of autism acceptance within society. That's one of the key factors when we're thinking about autistic burnout, because without that acceptance, demands are placed upon us that might not actually match our needs and our preferences. We might feel more need to be doing this camouflaging and masking. We might be placed in environments that don't accommodate for our sensory needs, that sort of thing. So I feel like this is kind of like an umbrella factor that can explain why a lot of these things do go wrong for autistic people. Okay. So a little bit more into what burnout looks like. So some of the core burnout traits, according to research by Stark et al., particularly the top three. The top three are the most common. Chronic exhaustion, so like a deep, deep sense of exhaustion. Loss of typical skills, including the ability to camouflage or mask. Decreased tolerance to stimuli and sensory inputs. Pardon me. Maybe an increase in repetitive behaviors, more frequent meltdowns or shutdowns, or that sort of emotion dysregulation, and also intensified mental health concerns such as co-occurring anxiety and depression. Again, I thought it might be useful just to provide an example from one autistic adult about their personal experience with burnout. So they said, I've experienced burnout multiple times. In fact, when I map out the timeline of my life in my head, burnout seems to be the key event into which different parts of my life are divided. It's terrifying, overwhelming, and there seems to be no understanding. For me, it's not the same as experiencing depression. It's being trapped in an exhausted body, having lost access to many valuable skills. I don't lose interest and I still feel and want to do things, but simply cannot. So again, autistic burnout can look different for different people. My experience with burnout is similar in the sense that it's happened multiple times and it's like an in and out sort of pattern. I personally have had instances where I have lost a lot of interest and motivation when I'm burnt out. Whereas this individual said that that's something that remains intact for them. So there's different experiences and different levels of it. But yeah, that's just sort of a little bit of insight into what it might feel like. Okay, I'm just going to take a pause, have some tea, and then we'll go into section 2. Got a cute little cat cup, you can see, yes. I'm actually a dog person, but I like cats as well. So. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the evidence-based strategies that help support autistic wellbeing. So the first one is peer support and authentic connection. So what is peer support? If this is something you're not really familiar with, it's when people with similar lived experiences come together to support one another. It's not unusual for people who aren't autistic to gain that, quite organically. They might feel like, by far and large, they feel connected with other people. They might have their experiences reflected back to them, understood, shared by others. When it comes to autistic individuals and also other neurominorities, it can be a lot harder for us to find our people and a lot harder to find that, people who have those similar lived experiences to us. So we can benefit from actively seeking that out and getting peer support. So there is some research as to the benefits of peer support. So in a 2020 study by Crompton et al., they interviewed 12 autistic adults about how it feels to spend time with friends and family that are autistic versus not autistic. And some of the key findings were that autistic adults felt more comfortable and better understood by autistic peers. They felt more belonging with other autistic people. They felt less of a need to mask or camouflage because there was a mutual understanding and acceptance of autistic ways of being and interacting. They found that as well, spending time with other autistic people was really important for maintaining their mental health and well-being and to help build resilience to manage everyday life in a mostly non-autistic world. And there's several recent studies that echo these findings and the benefits of peer support for autistic people and linking that to autistic wellbeing. So what are some practical ways that we can go about gaining peer support? One way is to connect with autistic professionals. So that can come in the form of like an autism coach, an autistic peer mentor, an autistic counsellor, or other therapists. This is just one potential way to gain, in a therapeutic sense, that validation, understanding, and support. Other ways are to attend autism support groups for autistic adults or kids. Like if you're looking for an autistic child, I think there are support groups out there for kids as well and teens. There are online events or groups, so there are Facebook groups, but also online events such as this one. And there's, I think, like mentoring events. That there's all sorts of things that I've seen online as well for autistic adults particularly. But even in a more sort of casual sense, just watching or following autistic content creators on different social media platforms. There's a lot out there that's readily available these days. And that's sort of where I started with getting peer support after, I realized that I was autistic. I sort of, connected with a lot of autistic content creators and felt that sense of validation for the first time in my life. So it's a good place to start if you're not, interested in these other ways of getting the peer support. Okay, now I'm going to go into some specific strategies for alexithymia. So this is some research from Cameron et al. In 2014. They did a systematic review of existing research at the time, because obviously this was a few years ago now. And they found that the most successful interventions for alexithymia, and this is in a therapeutic sense, just to contextualize it. So therapeutic interventions are most effective when they focused on identifying, describing, and understanding both emotional states and bodily sensations. And there had to be quite critically an exposure element during sessions. So having a client to, feel an emotion in a session and then guide them to describe the sensations that they're feeling, to identify the words, and also to learn coping strategies to deal with unpleasant sensations. And also just in general, in a therapeutic sense, increasing attention to body sensations and the link between those and our emotions and feelings can be really helpful. And some strategies to do that is through relaxation and mindfulness. And I guess if you're thinking more about, self-supporting yourself or a loved one who is autistic and you're not, if you're not a therapist, this might be a bit more relevant. So the key is really about, with alexithymia, to recognize and to label our emotional state, because this is often the first step in emotion regulation, self-soothing, and helping to reduce negative emotions. So practicing what's called emotion identification exercises can be a really big key to improving our emotional well-being if we are autistic and also have high alexithymic traits. But what's an example of an emotion identification exercise that's suitable for an autistic person with alexithymia? So obviously we did sort of go through before that if you do have alexithymia, that emotional identification doesn't come easy. It might not come intuitively, but there are sort of methods that can actually be helpful, such as visual aids. So visual aids like feeling wheels, matrices, different charts can provide a more systematic way for us to help identify and label our emotions if that's something that we struggle with. And once we can sort of name and pinpoint that emotion, it can be a really good starting point for emotion regulation. So you can see an example on the slide here. It's a little bit visually involved. I prefer the more sort of simple charts. Like when I look at this, I'm like, oh gosh, it's a bit overstimulating, but I know a lot of my clients particularly like this one. So yeah. Okay. Okay, so that brings me into the next topic of managing stress and sadness. So once we can, get past that hurdle of emotional identification and sort of pinpointing what is it that I'm feeling, that's when we can talk about, okay, so what are some strategies that we can use to manage emotions? So this was actually a second survey that I created, which was particularly looking at the mental health experiences of autistic women and non-binary people. So in this second survey, 200 autistic people took part. And one of the aspects that I looked into was this question around what are some autism-specific strategies that you use to help manage your stress? And there were 7 key themes that emerged from short answer responses. So this was like, it was an open-ended question and they could just type in the strategies they used. And then I just went through and pulled out key themes. There was pages of data and I just was like, okay, what are the themes that are popping up a lot over time from this data? So the top one was to do with alone time. So, for example, removing oneself from other people and also reducing sensory input. The second top theme was movement, so exercising, pacing, dancing, or some other physical activity. At this point, it's probably worth noting that a lot of the sample also had ADHD. There is a big overlap between autism and ADHD, so that might contextualize a little bit as to, why movement might be quite regulating sometimes as well. Meditation or mindfulness. So this was a little bit polarizing. Some of them were like, nope, I would never use meditation, but it still came up as the third top theme. So a decent proportion of the sample said that they find deep breathing or present moment awareness quite useful. Repetition. So engaging in simple repetitive rituals. So maybe cleaning or like a skincare ritual, whatever it is for the individual. Or stimming behaviors. So if you're not familiar with stimming, it's short for self-stimulatory behavior. It's usually some sort of repetitive movement. It might have a sensory component to it. It can be as simple as, sort of stroking hair like this. Some people use like fidget tools. I used to have, but it broke, like a squishy ball where I'd sort of squeeze that. So there's the repetitive component of the squeezing, but also the sensory. I like the feel of that. But yeah, stimming, it's very broad. It can encompass a lot of different behaviors. The next top theme was nature. So spending time outdoors or looking onto nature, engaging in hobbies or interests, particularly the hobbies and interests that they cited were ones that were quite soothing, simple, didn't take too much mental effort. Those were the sorts of interests that really helped to regulate stress. And also spending time with pets or watching animals. And I essentially asked the exact same question, but instead I was looking at the umbrella of sort of sad emotions, because obviously stress and sadness are quite different. Stress is more like a heightened state, whereas sadness is more almost like a low sort of, really sort of hypo-arousal kind of state. So the autism-specific strategies that came up for managing sad emotions, the top one was actually quite different from stress. It was seeking support from a safe person. So reaching out for affection, to vent or seek supportive advice. This was usually from a partner or a really close friend or family member. And in some instances, a therapist where there's a lot of good rapport with particular therapists. The second, alone time, so removing oneself from others. Emotion release came up as a new theme for managing sadness. So letting emotions out somehow. Engaging in existing hobbies and interests came up again. We had, spending time with animals was a strategy that repeated itself again for both sadness and stress. Resting was another one. So taking a nap, sleeping, just allowing ourselves to just rest and get our energy back up, and listening to music. Okay, so I just want to touch on really briefly just the importance of autistic interests. It was something that came up in both of my surveys. So the second survey, we can see there that interests and hobbies was quite important as an emotion management strategy for both stress and sadness. Also back to my first survey of the 144 autistic people, I looked at the function of autistic interests. So of this sample, 74% said that they had strong interests that last for years, but it's also quite common as well for strong interests to change frequently and to come and go, at least within this particular sample. And in terms of the function, a lot of the respondents said that their interests and hobbies bring them this sense of calmness, relaxation, or some other therapeutic benefit. They also described their interests as a way to escape, to express themselves authentically as well. Often in a world where, we can't be our authentic selves and we feel the need to mask. So I just thought that was just really interesting data that I wanted to touch on briefly. Okay, and lastly, we're just going to go through some autistic burnout strategies. So unfortunately, I was disappointed to find that there's not much research on autistic burnout. I think it's something that's probably only really coming into the research space quite in the last few years. A lot of studies sort of defining what is autistic burnout, what is this new concept, but not a lot looking at strategies. But I did find, after digging around for a little bit, I did find this research by Rainmaker et al. In 2020. So they did a thematic analysis of 19 interviews with autistic adults and also looked at public internet sources. And they were trying to understand and characterize autistic burnout, including ways that these autistic adults said that they relieve or prevent burnout when they experience it, but also advice that they have for other people. So some key strategies from this study were to do with acceptance and support. So again, that acceptance is coming up again, being around other people where we don't have to mask or camouflage, because that is such a massive energy drain that can put us into burnout quite quickly. Also getting formal supports, so in the form of reasonable adjustments at school or work, getting mental health support or other supports in daily life, just to reduce demands and bring more space to rest. And again, that feeds into this next one of reducing our load. So taking time off, taking more breaks, reducing social activity, and reducing exposure to stressful activities. And that's one I just want to touch on quickly, because that often conflicts with the advice for depression. So a lot of times autistic burnout and depression are confused in a clinical sense because they look quite similar on the surface, but the advice and strategies for each are quite distinct. The advice for depression is often get out, do more, get engaged, get that motivation and sort of that engagement with life back by going and doing things and getting that dopamine or whatever it is. Whereas with autistic burnout, it's like you actually need to take some space, reduce the load, and just build that energy back up before you go back out and do all the things. So it's just interesting to note that distinction there. The next strategy was attending to autistic needs, so stimming, spending time on interests, unmasking, using autistic strengths, whatever it is for the individual. Self-advocacy, and particularly around our health, is really important. So setting healthy boundaries, learning how to ask for help in a way that's effective and gets us the support that we need. And self-knowledge was really important as well. So learning to recognize and act on early signs of burnout, which can be hard for autistic individuals who do have alexithymia or alexithymic difficulties. So maybe working with a therapist about, trying to recognize those signs or trying to use strategies to recognize those early signs. And it can also be really helpful to have a diagnosis, obviously, for this as well. So we can pinpoint, is it autistic burnout? Is it something else? But yeah, I guess a key point with this is that there is only so much that as individuals at the individual level that we can do to support ourselves when it comes to burnout. There is definitely a need for systemic change at different levels of society to better accommodate and support the well-being of autistic people, particularly when it comes to burnout, but also with all of the things I've spoken about today. So there's a bit of research there that shows that there is a lot of work needed to increase community and clinician awareness of autism, but also autistic burnout specifically, as well as initiatives to improve unaccommodating environments to reduce that risk that we're falling into burnout. And also research that, non-surprisingly to me at least, there's a pervasive lack of awareness and stigma about autism, and that there is a link with this lack of awareness and stigma and autistic burnout. So in this particular research, they suggested that increasing awareness and acceptance of autism could be a big key to burnout prevention and recovery. So I just wanted to touch on that. It's easy to say, as an autistic person, we need to be doing this and all this, but we also need to be supported by our surrounding environments for a lot of this to be effective as well. I think that is it. Yes. Okay. So here's a list of references. And yeah, thank you everyone so much for listening to me talk about autistic wellbeing. If you do want to support me to create, more content, but also with my mission at Finding Autism, there's a few different ways that you can do that here.